Okay, this is chapter 2. Read aloud. To the manner born. And our big question is, how were the lives of serfs and lords different from one another? If you lived during the Middle Ages, your life followed one of a few set paths. If you were the child of a king and a queen, or a lord and a lady, you lived a privileged life. You had enough food to eat and clothes to wear. You lived in a relatively nice house. You had servants too. You may have been one of the few who learned to read and write. You even learned to ride a horse. If you were a boy, you learned to become a skilled swordsman. Privileged girls may have learned to embroider, to dance, and to play a musical instrument. Occasionally, girls too learn to read. As a privileged child, you likely grew up to become a king or a queen, or a lord or a lady yourself. So this is what a privileged family in the Middle Ages would look like. They had everything they could ever imagine. They probably even had people working for them. Clothes, food, anything. So they didn't have to struggle for what they had. But most people in the Middle Ages were not privileged. In the early Middle Ages, nearly everyone in Europe worked on the land. Most farm workers were called serfs. Serfs grew the food and tended to the livestock or animals that fed the people. Some had more freedom than others and were called freemen. Serfs were at the bottom of the social order and had the least amount of power. Serfs usually spent their entire lives working on a landowner's or lord estate. In return for the work they did, the lord allowed serfs to use some of the land to grow their own food. The lord lived in his castle or manor house. He owned all the land around his home and often the nearby towns and villages too. The Lord also controlled the lives of most of the people who worked for him. Okay, let's take a look back at the pecking order for the Middle Ages. So at the bottom, you had the serfs or the freemen. Above that was the middle class, including the merchants and craftsmen, people who worked with their hands, built things, and people who sold things out on the open land. And then you had the nobles, including the lords, and then the church leaders, and then you had the king. Serfs worked on the land throughout the year. So here's just a couple pictures of them, and this is what they would be doing. Serfs were not educated. They did not learn to read or write. If serfs wanted to travel to a nearby town, they needed permission from the Lord. When serfs wanted to marry, the Lord had the right to approve or disapprove of the match. When serfs had children, those children usually grew up to work as serfs for the same lord. In the Middle Ages, serfs worked on farmland that was divided into strips. The serfs spent about half of their time working for the Lord. The rest of the time they worked on the strips of land where their own crops were grown. Most serfs lived in small, simple houses in or near a village. Their houses were made from wood and mud. The roofs were thatched, meaning they were made from rushes or straw. They usually had just one room. Serfs slept on straw beds. Inside each house was a small fireplace for cooking. Smoke from the fire escaped through a hole in the roof. The Lord increased his wealth in many different ways, in addition to working the farmland for the Lord. Serfs paid taxes to the Lord in the form of money, crops, and livestock. Sometimes the Lord ran a mill and even charged his serfs a fee to grind their grain into flour. If crops failed or illness struck, people during the Middle Ages struggled to survive. In times of hardship, the Lord did not always come to the aid of his serfs, even when food supplies were low. Serfs were not allowed to hunt in the Lord's forests. However, to avoid starving, people sometimes hunted illegally. This was called poaching, and serfs who were caught poaching were severely punished. Some farm workers were free men. Free men were not under the same strict control of the Lord. If a serf ran away from his home and managed to live for a year and a day in a town without being found, he would become a free man too. The Middle Ages was a violent time compared to how we live today. There were frequent wars and uprisings, including rebellions against the king by rival nobles. The need for armed protection shaped medieval society. Usually, high-ranking nobles swore their loyalty to the king, and lords swore their loyalty to higher-ranking nobles. Free men and serfs had to be loyal to their lord. In exchange for their loyalty, the Lord offered his protection. If the Lord needed to raise an army, he would require freemen on his estates to serve as foot soldiers. From an early age, you work a full day. You wake up just before sunrise and go to sleep when it is dark. For breakfast, you have rye bread and water, or perhaps watery ale. Even before the sun is fully risen, and regardless of the weather, you begin your work on the land. In springtime, you are busy plowing and planting seeds. You assist in the delivery of baby lambs and calves. At midday, you walk home for a simple meal of rye bread and maybe a small piece of cheese. After lunch, you return to work, cutting logs for the Lord's fire. In the summer months, you tend to the crops you planted. In the spring, you keep the hungry birds, and insects away from the growing crops. Autumn, the time to harvest crops, is perhaps the busiest time of all. You help your mother and sisters pick fruits and berries, which they preserve and store for the winter using a simple tool called a scythe. You harvest grain crops such as wheat, oats, rye, and barley. You help store the grain. A good harvest makes everyone, especially the Lord, very happy. It means there is food to eat during the winter months. A good harvest is a time of celebration for all. Nevertheless, you have to get used to having less food to eat in the winter time and to feeling hungry and cold more often than not. At times, your parents find it difficult to make ends meet. Even if ice and snow lay upon the frozen earth, you still have jobs to do. You have to feed and care for the livestock. You repair fences and barns. All the while you continue to work on your family's strips of land. Each evening, as the sun is setting, you return home quite exhausted. You end your day with a meal called pottage that your mother or sisters have prepared. Pottage is a vegetable stew with grain and a tiny piece of meat or fish in it. After a good night's sleep, you will wake up and do it all again.